Tego Colorados. Tego Smenjus Tano Renato. Tano Ganaka Ganjota. Colorados Nesumoi Joyous when Zarata one being one of it and a guy sent him Zata and Colorados Mr. Schutter Ziga Guamza. So on I would like to welcome Mr. Schutter and his team to traditional Mohawk territory in Montreal. It is the territory of the people of the Longhouse. The community I come from, Ganesabagi, is 62 kilometers northwest of Montreal. It is the oldest Mohawk community in existence. It was the first to accept Gainarapo, or the Great Law of Peace, and is thus mentioned in the centuries-old condolence rights of the people of the Longhouse. I also just want to for you to take note that we are part of a joint submission that was sent to you regarding the FAO voluntary guidelines on governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forest in the context of national food security and the discrimination and subjugation of Indigenous peoples' rights. The traditional activities of the Iroquois people are hunting, fishing, and agriculture. The tradition of corn, beans, and squash, also known as the Three Sisters, when eaten together, is a complete protein. And we know that it also has more than just cultural significance, but it has spiritual significance to our health and well-being. According to our creation story, the Three Sisters were said to have grown from the body of Mother Earth after she died giving birth to the twins. And we quote from our creation story, "Thus the food of her bosom continued to nourish her children." Unfortunately, we have many challenges here in Canada, and we have been dispossessed of our traditional territories. We have been told repeatedly by the Canadian government in various different ways that we, the Mohawks of Ganesabagi, have no legitimate rights to land in what is known as Canada, as we are considered 17th century immigrants from New York State. Canada's sovereignty is based on three legal fictions: the doctrine of discovery, terra nullius, and the doctrine of conquer. These doctrines have legitimized the land grabs which have been going on in North America since European contact. Canadian property law is based upon these legal fictions and have been further legitimized by the Indian Act and its policies, causing Indigenous people to be further dispossessed and also negatively impacting our political, economic, social, and cultural rights. The 1876 Indian Act, which was consolidated in 1876, and its spirit of discrimination is the basis of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. It allows Canada to undermine Indigenous peoples of their collective rights and dispossess them of their lands and territories. An amendment in 1880 gave the federal government the right to hold in trust funds that belong to Indigenous people, resource funds, which we must ask for from the federal government on how to use these funds. And so the lands reserved that are held in trust and the title to the land and all its resources falls to the Crown and not to the Indigenous peoples who our territory belongs to. The Indian Act does not protect traditional territories of Indigenous peoples, nor the lands reserved for them from third-party interests. And land claims negotiations, third-party interests will continue while negotiations going on, which at the end of the day leaves us with developed land that we can no longer farm, which also negatively impacts the quality of water that we have to drink. The outdated provisions, land management provisions of the Indian Act also do not provide for environmental protection or address economic development. The environmental protection laws do not apply in communities. That's why most of the toxic waste dumps in Canada are close and on First Nations territories. The collective right of self-determination is inextricably linked to the right to food, food security, and food sovereignty, as affirmed in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 11, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 24. It is also recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which both, by the way, are aspirational in nature. As the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights has stated on the right to food is linked to Indigenous languages and culture, and inter alia to the right to life, to health, and adequate housing. The current government of Canada continues to claim that the UN Declaration is only aspirational and therefore cannot be used in any kind of land negotiations or human rights advocacy. And yet, the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of Canada, has recently stated that domestic courts are free to rely on the UN Declaration when interpreting Indigenous peoples' human rights. They state the following: various sources of human rights law, declarations, covenants, conventions, judicial and quasi-judicial decisions of the international tribunals, customary norms, must, in my opinion, be relevant and persuasive sources for interpretation of the Canadian Charter provisions. There is also another more insidious component of the Indian Act, and that is the definition of who is an Indian. It is estimated if we continue with the current definition of the Indian Act of who is an Indian, in 40 or to 50 years' time there will be no status Indians, hence no need for reserves, no need to protect the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. I also would like to mention some of the following challenges that Indigenous peoples face through Canada's actions at the international arenas. They include the Nagoya Protocol, which is based solely on established rights of Indigenous peoples, in spite of the fact that in its preamble it states, quote, the importance of genetic resources to food security, and the protocol also includes the interrelationship between genetic resources and traditional knowledge. Canada has stated and refused to take a rights-based approach in any kind of participation in these arenas. The strict term of established rights and not on customary rights has been held discretionary by the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, as underlined by the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Canada refused to recognize the free, prior, and informed consent, and only using meaningful consultation, but not consent, but will accommodate our concerns. They have tabled a Bill S8 in Parliament called Safe Drinking Water for First Nations, which will set a legal precedent if passed, as the government confers power to itself to abrogate or derogate from any existing Aboriginal or treaty rights. New proposed amendments to Canada's Fisheries Act will allow government to have discretionary powers, speed track development, and bypass the government's legal duty to consult. We urge the Special Rapporteur on the right to food. We respectfully urge the Special Rapporteur on the right to food to make strong and effective recommendations to Canada. Development has taken prime agricultural land, which we need for our growing population. We are working with the Union Producteur Agricole du Québec at our local level to try and stop mining development that continues to persist and which will take, if allowed, a permit, will utilize 2 million gallons of water a day. We have well water, where most of our communities have well water, and this will contaminate our well water. There's a farming law that is still on the books, which forbids Indigenous people from selling their agricultural products to the public. When we have been told by Revenu Quebec and various economic development in INAC, the fact that if we persist to have any kind of businesses that are in competition with Quebecois or Canadian business people, that they will shut us down. Indigenous people cannot compete with the non-natives. There's also a whole list of other it's a very complex situation that Indigenous people have in Canada. I'm thankful to the organizers for letting us speak. I hope that I'm only from one small community here in the region. And I just want to say that lasting peace, whether it cannot be achieved by military or political means, it cannot continue with the status quo. It cannot exist when there is fear and anger between our peoples. We had an apology for the residential school system that occurred in Canada where they forcibly took children. And I know that I'm supposed to stop speaking, but I'm the only Indigenous person here. And I beg your indulgence for just a moment longer. We are coming to the point where we will be assimilated into, we're at a turning point where we're going to be assimilated into the Canadian mainstream. where we will no longer have our youth speak their languages, practice their culture or ceremonies, because we do not have access to our lands and their resources. That's who we are as Indigenous people. And when we defend our rights, they will do as they did 22 years ago, come in for the paramilitary force, with the Canadian Army, and criminalize us for defending our land that we have a legitimate right to defend. And I think that's one thing that this government of Canada, they work in a very dysfunctional way, and they refuse to respect even their own rule of law. So we ask that that land tenure is not separated from the collective rights of Indigenous peoples. So thank you very much for allowing me the time to speak.